They never really feared the plant itself, my friend. They feared what it could unlock in a man's mind and soul. Long before anyone in Washington decided to write it into a law book, before the TV preachers wagged their fingers, before newspapers splashed scare headlines across the front page, this plant was sitting quietly in the fields, in the mountains, in the gardens of people who understood its real purpose. They didn't look at it as some mischievous little vice. They looked at it the way a carpenter looks at a trusted tool, or the way a sailor looks at a compass. It was a guide, a wayfinder, something that could take you from the noise of the everyday into the stillness where truth lives. But you and I were never told that part of the story. What we were given was a version of reality shaped by fear and regulation, a reality designed to keep the lid tightly on any part of you that might wake up and start asking questions they don't want asked. They buried the sacred under propaganda so thick it could choke the memory right out of a people. They twisted it until the plant that once connected seekers to the divine was rebranded into a joke, a criminal threat, a reason for handcuffs. I know you've seen it. How the word weed became shorthand for laziness, for trouble, for aimless kids with smoke curling out of their mouths. That image wasn't an accident. It was designed to keep you from looking deeper. The truth they never wanted you to remember is that cannabis was never just about getting high. It was about seeing clearly. It was about softening that rigid shell of ego we all carry and opening the heart just enough for the light to get in. It was about tuning the mind to frequencies most folks will never touch in a lifetime of rushing from one chore to the next. You've been taught to see weed as something that dulls, but in reality, when approached with care, it reveals. It doesn't cover the mirror, it wipes it clean. And once you see what it can show you, you'll understand why they worked so hard to bury it. Long before anyone thought to criminalize it, cannabis was holy. In ancient India they called it sacred grass, said it belonged to Shiva, the god who destroys what's false and births what's true. In the old temples of Egypt, they mixed it into oils, burned it in rituals, let its smoke rise like a prayer toward the ceiling of the gods. Indigenous tribes here in the Americas used it not as a party favor but in ceremony. Shared in silence, with the fire crackling, each person holding it as if it were a living thing, not some disposable distraction. That's the thing, brother, it wasn't entertainment. It was a bridge. It was a living doorway to something far greater than ourselves. The ones who knew this and passed it down through the centuries didn't see cannabis as a threat to health or morality. They saw it as a teacher. And like all great teachers, it didn't scream for your attention. It simply waited for you to be ready, then showed you what you needed to see, not what you wanted to see. But all of that, the reverence, the understanding, the generational wisdom, was buried under a war that was never really about drugs at all. They told you cannabis was dangerous, addictive, a path to ruin. But the real danger, the one they were truly worried about, was never the plant. It was what the plant could wake up in a man. Because here's the thing. Once you start seeing clearly, feeling fully, questioning the rules you've been swallowing since you were a boy, you become harder to control. And nothing disrupts control more powerfully, yet more gently, than a tool that brings you into the present moment, that makes you aware of the prison you've been walking through as if it were home. That's why the so-called war on drugs was really a war on consciousness. It was an attack on any path that led you to truth without a permission slip from organized religion or a state-sanctioned ideology. Cannabis didn't fit the system's idea of spirituality because it couldn't be owned, taxed, or packaged into a Sunday sermon. It offered direct experience, not secondhand belief, and that made it dangerous. Not to the body, but to the blueprint of control. So they flipped the script. They turned the sacred into something scandalous. The herb became weed. The ritual became rebellion. The teacher became the butt of a joke. They made it look foolish, so you'd never be curious enough to look closer. They painted users as weak so you'd never notice how many thinkers, artists, healers, and seekers kept returning to it, not for escape but for insight. They replaced wisdom with warnings. And for a time it worked. But truth is a stubborn thing. Can be delayed, not destroyed. That's why cannabis keeps resurfacing. Why people still feel drawn to it even after decades of slander. Because it carries something older than culture, older than law, something they can't legislate out of existence. It's not here to solve your problems. Not here to hand you enlightenment on a silver platter. It's here to show you the parts of yourself you've been taught to avoid, the rooms you've locked up inside your own house. And in that way, it's a spiritual mirror. One that doesn't flatter, but reveals. One that won't let you run, but will sit you down in front of yourself and wait. Not everyone's ready for that kind of reflection. Many won't like what they see. But those who face it start to understand what the ancients always knew. That this plant isn't here to entertain you. It's here to wake you up. And brother, once you're awake, you can't go back to sleep the same way again. That's why they feared it. That's why they still do. Because an awakened man is the hardest thing in the world to control. You and I both know, brother, that the truth has a way of slipping through even the tightest nets. And with cannabis, the deeper you look, the more you realize its power isn't just about what it does to the body, but what it awakens in the mind. In Chapter 1, we talked about how they buried its sacred roots under propaganda, how they feared the awakening more than the plant itself. But there's a layer most people never hear about, a layer that makes their fear even more obvious. The connection between this humble plant and the mysterious little gland tucked away deep inside your head. They call it the pineal gland, but for thousands of years mystics have called it something else. The third eye, the seat of the soul, the doorway to higher consciousness. It's no bigger than a grain of rice, yet for civilizations from Egypt to India, it was the key to visions, intuition, and states of awareness that most of us only brush against in dreams. In ancient Egypt, they painted it into the eye of Horus, not as decoration, but as a coded map to the brain's hidden architecture. In India, the bindi was more than an ornament. It marked the very center of spiritual sight. And in the hidden corners of esoteric traditions, from Hermetic teachings to theosophy, the pineal gland was revered as the organ that sees beyond the physical. Science today will tell you it regulates sleep and circadian rhythms, but the mystics knew it does far more. It opens you to a different kind of light, one you can't see with your eyes. Now here's where cannabis steps onto the stage in a way that makes the old systems nervous. THC, the psychoactive compound in cannabis, appears to interact with the pineal gland directly, stimulating blood flow, shifting perception, loosening the mind's grip on fixed reality. You might have felt it yourself. The way time stretches, colors deepen, silence becomes alive. That's not just a high. That's your perception being rerouted from the rational into the intuitive, from the constant chatter of the mind into the quieter, richer language of symbols, feelings, and frequencies. The pineal gland doesn't talk in words, my friend. It whispers in sensations, in moments when you feel truth instead of just think about it. But here's the catch. This doorway doesn't open for tourists. It opens for pilgrims. You don't stumble into higher consciousness by accident. You tune into it. And tuning requires stillness, humility, and intention. That's why ancient cultures paired sacred plants with sacred practice. Fasting, prayer, preparation. They understood what modern users forget. That the state you bring into the experience shapes the experience you have. If your mind is cluttered with fear, avoidance, or distraction, cannabis will amplify that. It doesn't change the station, you're the station. It just turns up the volume. This is why the same strain that makes one man feel at peace can make another man feel paranoid. It's not the plant betraying him. It's the ego resisting its own unraveling. You see, the ego survives through control. It needs to define you, label you, keep you busy protecting an identity it built from other people's expectations. And when cannabis, used with respect, starts to quiet that voice, the ego fights back. Some feel anxiety. Some feel their thoughts spiral. But that's not harm, it's the detox of the spirit. It's the old noise rising to the surface so it can finally be faced. This is where most people turn away. They chase numbness instead of clarity, using the plant to escape rather than to explore. And when you treat it like a crutch, that's all it will ever be. But if you approach it like a tuning fork, something shifts. Cannabis can align you with parts of yourself you forgot, parts buried under decades of busyness, pain, and conditioning. Used with presence, it can slow the brain into theta and alpha waves, the same waves found in deep meditation or in the edge between waking and dreaming. In these states, time softens, thought loosens, and awareness expands beyond the narrow corridor of daily routine. You start to feel music instead of just hearing it. You sense the weight behind a word instead of only its sound. You catch the subtle currents of emotion in yourself and in others, currents you've been ignoring because life told you to move too fast. This is where vibration stops being a poetic metaphor and becomes an experience. You notice that joy has a hum to it, that gratitude carries a lightness in the chest, that fear pulls you tight and low, and you realize, sometimes painfully, that you've been tuned to the wrong stations for years, letting anger or worry set the frequency of your life. Cannabis doesn't fix that for you. It doesn't erase the low vibrations. What it does is bring them into focus so you can finally retune yourself. That's the danger as far as the old systems are concerned. Because once you know you can shift your own frequency, you stop depending on their distractions, their manufactured fears, their endless noise. You stop playing the role they wrote for you. And a man who remembers his own power is no longer manageable. But here's the truth they never taught us in school. The difference between medicine and poison has always been intention and dosage. You can use the same plant to rise or to fall. You can use it to sharpen your vision or blur it. The plant itself is neutral, it doesn't judge. It meets you where you are. If you show up with respect, it will reflect that respect back in insight. If you show up running from yourself, it will mirror that avoidance until you can't pretend anymore. That's why the ancients set intentions before they touched it. They didn't light it casually. They asked not for a high but for a lesson. Maybe it was clarity about a decision. Maybe it was courage to face grief. Maybe it was guidance for a community in trouble. And because they treated the plant as a partner, not a product, it responded as a partner. We've lost that in the modern world. We reach for it like a drink, a snack, a quick break from reality. And then we wonder why the experience feels hollow. The truth is, cannabis is like a mirror. You can polish it with preparation and see yourself clearly, or you can hold it in the dark and complain about the lack of reflection. When you use it to look inward, to open the third eye, to retune the vibration of your being, it's not a pastime, it's a practice. And practices, my friend, change people. That's why those in power fear them. That's why they turned the pineal gland into a forgotten footnote in biology textbooks, why they mocked the very idea of energy and vibration. Because a man who sees beyond the surface can't be sold the surface anymore. You and I know time is too precious now to live half awake. And if a simple green plant, growing freely from the earth, can help you remember how to see with more than just your eyes, then maybe that's the very reason they worked so hard to make you forget. Brother, by now you can probably feel we've been walking deeper into something that isn't just about a plant, it's about a relationship. In the first part we stripped away the lies about its history. In the second we looked at the way it touches the deepest part of the mind, that quiet third eye they've been trying to make you forget you even have. But now I want to take you into the way this plant works when you stop treating it like a thing and start approaching it like a being. I know that might sound strange at first, plants as beings, as teachers, but that's exactly how countless cultures saw it for thousands of years before the word stoner was ever invented. To them, cannabis wasn't just green leaves and smoke. It was a presence with personality, patience, and power. They didn't use it the way a man uses a hammer. They communed with it like you might sit with an old friend who knows you well enough to call you out when you're lying to yourself. In the Amazon, shamans speak of plant spirits as real as the birds in the trees, each with its own lessons and temperament. Some are strict, some are gentle, some test you until you break through the surface of your own stubbornness. Cannabis, they say, is a feminine spirit, nurturing but direct, not aggressive but unwilling to entertain your illusions. And when you meet it honestly, it meets you the same way. Science has no language for this. They're only just now discovering that trees talk to each other through root networks, that mushrooms trade nutrients and warnings underground. But if nature already communicates with itself in ways our machines can't measure, why is it so hard to believe a plant might respond to your energy, your mood, your intention? That would explain why two people can smoke the exact same flower and have completely different experiences. One feels inspired and grounded. The other feels restless or scattered. The difference isn't in the plant, it's in the person's frequency going in. Cannabis doesn't drag you somewhere you weren't already headed. It amplifies the path you're on. So if you approach it restless, it might make that restlessness louder. If you approach it with openness, it can deepen that openness into something unshakable. That's why honesty matters so much. You can fool your friends, your boss, maybe even your family about where your head and heart are, but you can't fool the plant. It listens to the truth beneath your words. And if you want it to show you something worthwhile, you've got to strip away the performance. That's what ancient users understood instinctively. They'd clear a space, set an intention, sometimes fast or pray beforehand, not out of superstition, but to make sure they were showing up clean, in body, in mind, in spirit. They weren't chasing a high, they were seeking a conversation. And when you treat the experience like that, it changes everything. The high stops being a fog and becomes a doorway. The thoughts that surface aren't random. They're messages, pieces of yourself you've been ignoring. Sometimes that message is gentle, like a reminder to slow down. Sometimes it's sharp, like a mirror showing you a truth you've been running from for decades. But either way, it's coming from the same place, your own deeper awareness, the one the plant helps you tune into. Modern culture makes this sound mystical or sentimental, but it's really just about presence. If you sit in a room with someone who loves you and you're both quiet long enough, things start to rise to the surface. Feelings, memories, understandings. Cannabis is like that friend, except it's a friend that connects you to the parts of yourself you've let fall silent. And once those parts start speaking again, you can't help but see your life differently. You notice where you've been hiding. You see the patterns you've been stuck in. And you realize, sometimes painfully, that the systems outside you aren't the only ones keeping you in a cage. You've been building bars around yourself too. That realization is the start of liberation. And liberation is what every empire, every rigid institution fears. It's why they've mocked and outlawed every sacred plant they could. Not because these plants cause chaos in the streets, but because they cause clarity in the soul. And a man with clarity is not an easy man to own. You've seen how they've portrayed cannabis users in movies and TV. Sluggish, confused, useless. You almost never see them shown as seekers, healers, or visionaries. That's not a mistake. That's narrative control. Because if you knew that people have been using this plant to deepen meditation, to connect with spirit, to heal trauma, to inspire art, you might start wondering what else they've lied to you about. And the truth is, they can't erase the plant's memory. They can't stop the way it keeps showing up in the hands of people ready to use it consciously. In living rooms where friends gather in quiet to share a joint before deep conversation. In studios where an artist lets the edges of the world blur just enough to see a new angle. In backyards where a man sits alone under the stars and finally lets himself feel what he's been holding back for years. These moments don't make the headlines, but they are the quiet revolutions, the places where remembering begins. And remembering is dangerous to any system built on keeping you asleep. Because when you remember the sacred, you also remember yourself. You remember that spirit doesn't just live in temples or under steeples. It lives in the earth, in the air, in your own breath. Cannabis isn't here to save you, and it isn't here to solve your problems. It's here to walk with you while you face them. Sometimes it shows you beauty. Sometimes it shows you the mess you've been pretending isn't there. But if you keep showing up with intention, it keeps showing up with honesty. And over time, that relationship deepens. It becomes less about the plant and more about the connection it helps you cultivate, with yourself, with others, with the pulse of life itself. That's why I believe it's time to make it sacred again. Not in the sense of putting it on a pedestal or turning it into a trend, but by meeting it the way you'd meet a trusted elder, with respect, with patience, with the willingness to listen more than you speak. When you do that, the high isn't the point anymore. The high is just the doorway you walk through to get to the real work. The remembering, the retuning, the rebuilding of a life that feels true to who you are. And maybe that's why, after all these years of lies, after all the attempts to turn it into a joke or a crime, the plant is still here, waiting for whoever's ready. Not to entertain them, not to numb them, but to invite them into the one place they've been trained to avoid. Their own honest, unfiltered self. That's the place the world needs more of right now. And if a green leaf can help a man find it, then maybe that's worth fighting to protect.